Welcome, everyone, guests, colleagues, and friends. Welcome to Queen Mary, University of London for Professor Richard Buck's inaugural lecture. Richard was born and brought up not far from here, about 30 miles south, near Five Oak Green in Kent. His family tree consists of at least 4 generations of farmers on both sides. He grew up on the family farm surrounded by trees in woodlands, hedges, and apple orchards. Much of his childhood and youth, as you can imagine, were spent climbing, cutting, carving these trees, and later pruning and picking apples. He was educated at a local grammar school, Jard, in Tunbridge, and he intended to go to university to read agriculture. However, as many of his friends were applying to Oxbridge, he decided to apply to do natural sciences at Cambridge, with crop sciences at Reading University as his backup. To his surprise, I'm sure, not much a surprise to his friends or families, he got into Cambridge and ended up with a first-class degree in plant sciences. He was particularly inspired by Professor John Parker, whose lectures then mainly consists of his own research on chromosome evolution in plants. Much of this work was carried out in early of his career at Queen Mary, University of London. Richard then returned to the farm for a year marked by floods, foot and mouth disease, and a large bonfire. Discouraged, he went to do a DPhil at Oxford, working with John Pennell, who is now a professor at the University of Lausanne, on the evolutionary ecology of plants with whole genome duplications. After this, Richard moved to the University of Florida to work with Doug and Pam Saltis, who are leading figures in plants evolutionary genetics and members of the National Academy of Sciences in the US. It was in their laboratory Richard met Professor Andrew Leach. Andrew is in the audience somewhere. Thank you, Andrew. Visiting from Queen Mary, who encouraged him to apply for a fellowship and return to the UK, and more specifically, to come to Queen Mary. This worked, and Richard came to Queen Mary in 2010 with a NERC project working for the genomic signatures of past hybridization in British birch trees, with help from Professor Richard Nichols. I saw Richard earlier, and Richard set up a group with a number of PhD students to look into this area of research. In a conversation over lunch, Andrew Leach encouraged him as the only person then working on tree genomics in the UK to apply for a grant to sequence the ash genome. Suddenly, he found his research had moved from a quiet backwater into a full flood of public attention and indeed public funding as well. He was promoted to a senior lecturer in 2012 and started to work 4 days a week at the Royal Botanic Garden, Kew, and that was in 2016. He was promoted to his professorship at Queen Mary University of London in 2018, of which this inaugural is a somewhat belated celebration. As well as birch and ash trees, Richard now works on oak and elm. His research seeks the genetic basis of resistance to pests and pathogens in these trees and the genetic basis of their adaptation to different climates. He recently helped set up a new center for forest protection as a DEFRA-funded partnership between Kew and the Forest Research. He sits on the UK government Trees and Woodlands Scientific Advisory Group. Perhaps somewhat unusual for an evolutionary biologist working in a top university, Richard is a Christian. And he sometimes gives talks on science and Christianity, one of which I heard recently at a dinner party hosted by my neighbors Sid and Adam Sparks. I have asked Richard to speak on this theme this evening, and I hope this will make an interesting and stimulating lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together to welcome Professor Richard Buggs.
Well, thank you, Professor Wen Wang, for that very kind introduction. And as Professor Wang has mentioned, this isn't going to be an ordinary inaugural. I've been asked to talk about the subject of science and the Christian faith. In some ways, I'm very pleased. In some ways, I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed not to be giving an ordinary inaugural because I won't have the chance to thank all of the people who've helped me and worked with me during my career. But I'm grateful that Professor Wang has named a few of those people who have been particularly influential and to whom I'm particularly grateful. The other reason why I'm slightly regretful is it would have been much easier to have given an ordinary inaugural, and this has been a lot more work than a normal inaugural lecture would have been. I want to come somewhat obliquely at the subject of Christianity and science, which I've been asked to speak about, by talking about trees of life, because trees of life are mentioned by Charles Darwin and also in the Bible, and trees are what I work on, and Darwinian trees of life are something that I use in my research. And so I thought to bring these two concepts together in parallel and compare and contrast them might be a gentle way into this topic. Of course, there's a lot that I won't be able to cover, but hopefully in an hour's lecture I can at least give you something to think about in this area. So trees of life, do they exist? Well, I'm going to start with the easiest kind of tree of life, which is the kind of tree of life that I work on, trees like ash trees and birch trees and oak trees. Here's a picture of an ash tree. So trees of life, living trees. If you go to Kew Gardens, where I work 4 days a week, in the shop you can find a game for sale called Tree Bingo. And I've taken some of the beautiful paintings from Tree Bingo and used them in this slide here. They're by Holly Exley. And you can see a large number of plants that all of us would very happily call trees. But I want to ask the question, well, do trees actually exist? And this will enable me to introduce a few of the concepts that I'll be touching on during the rest of the lecture. Do trees exist? So Aristotle, when he did his first classification of plants, he divided them into trees and herbs. And sometimes he put shrubs in there as well, but I'm going to keep it simple, trees and herbs. And so at that time, when you talked about a tree, you were talking about a scientific group, if we can use the term scientific for 300 BC. A scientific classification is one where you have groups subordinate to groups. So you had trees and herbs within plants. But then the British botanist John Ray noticed that there were big differences between palms and the other trees. And indeed, palms in some ways had more in common with a blade of grass than they did with an oak tree. And he noticed also that they differ in their number of seed leaves, which are known as cotyledons. So he divided plants into two groups, the dicots and the monocots. And to start with, his classification looked like this. He kept Aristotle's trees and herbs, and then had monocots and dicots in both of those categories. But he recognised that this was rather unphilosophical, and later classifiers moved the monocots and dicots up a layer and made trees and herbs subordinate to both of them. So from this point on, trees was not something which named a coherent group within biological classifications. It was divided between two more major groups. Then the British botanist Brown recognised that there was a big difference between what we now call angiosperms and gymnosperms. They differ in the degree of covering they have over their seeds. And so he further split up the trees. Now some of them were gymnosperms and some were angiosperms. And I've highlighted here in brown those which are gymnosperms. And so now we had a more complicated classification, and this is the one that Darwin would have learned as a student. We have seed plants divided into monocots and dicots, and then the dicots divided into angiosperms and gymnosperms. And trees are occurring in all of these groups. So trees were split up more and more and more. And then Braun, he flipped over the order of gymnosperms versus monocots and dicots, and essentially had a classification similar to what we have today. So here we are. Trees are not a single group in biological classifications. But do trees exist? Well, we would all say, yes, of course they do. We all talk about trees all the time. Here's a few organisations I work with, the Tree Council, Trees for Life, the England Trees Action Plan that the UK government has. And more than ever before, we recognise that we need trees. We want to plant more trees. At the last general election, the parties were competing on the number of trees that they could promise to plant. We recognise that trees are very important to human health and human psychology as well. And we're also concerned about the health of trees. So I happily say I spend my time working on trees, even though I know that in some ways, scientifically, trees are not a group. It's a bit like this. If you walk into your kitchen and you have two sets of crockery, you might face a situation where how do you classify a set of 6 objects like this? Well, one way of doing it is to say, well, there are bowls and there are mugs and there are teapots, and I could probably group the mugs and the teapots as things with handles. So I have a classification of groups subordinate to groups. But also, I can equally well classify them as the Denby Halo set and the Denby Imperial Blue set. And both of those classifications make perfect sense, but they just have different uses. And it's a bit like that with our trees. So do trees exist? Well, I think we can probably all agree that they do. So that's probably a relief to all of you that I've come down there. Now, the next two are going to be slightly more complicated and slightly more controversial. Do the trees of life exist in Darwinian terms and in biblical terms? So let's start with the Darwinian Tree of Life. Here's a picture of it from the Darwin Tree of Life project. The idea that everything is descended from a common ancestor, and we have a bifurcating tree that shows the history of these organisms as they gradually diversified from a single lineage. Here's the first tree that Darwin drew in his notebook that was famously stolen and then returned to Cambridge University Library. And Darwin writes about the tree of life like this in The Origin of Species. The affinities of all the beings of the same class have sometimes been represented by a great tree. I believe this simile largely speaks the truth. The limbs divided into great branches and these into lesser and lesser branches were themselves once, when the tree was small, budding twigs. And this connection of the former and present buds by ramifying branches may well represent the classification of all extinct and living species in groups subordinate to groups, as buds give rise by growth to fresh buds, and these, if vigorous, branch out and overtop on all sides many a feebler branch. That's natural selection coming in here. So by generation, I believe, it has been with the great tree of life, which fills with its dead and broken branches the crust of the earth, and covers the surface with its ever-branching and beautiful ramifications. Great bit of Darwin's prose there. So let's think closely about what he's saying. He's saying there's really two lines of evidence for the Darwinian tree of life. One is that it fills with its dead and broken branches the crust of the earth. That is obviously the fossil record. And then in addition, it covers the surface with its ever-branching and beautiful ramifications. And he spoke earlier about groups subordinate to groups. And so you can see that if life indeed comes from a tree of life, then we should have groups subordinate to groups. The circles I've drawn on this figure show you different sizes of groups, and you can see the subordination of some groups to others. This is what you predict from a tree structure. So if we go back to our crockery analogy, if you're presented with a teapot, a cup, and a bowl, you can look at the group subordinate to groups and you can infer a tree-like structure. And then if you had a fossil record, you would hope to be able to see intermediates leading up to those different items. Those are the two lines of evidence for Darwin's tree of life. So let's look closely at these two lines of evidence. Firstly, looking at the fossil record and then groups subordinate to groups. And I'll restrict my comments here to the plant tree of life because that's the one that I'm most familiar with. I think many of the things I say are partly at least true of animals, but I won't venture there as I'm not a zoologist. In 1867, a Christian biologist who was head of paleobotany at the Natural History Museum wrote a pamphlet that was based on a lecture that he'd given in the library at University College London to the Geologists Association. And here is the copy that we have in the library at Kew, which was given to the man who identified the fungi that Darwin collected on his Beagle voyage. And William Carruthers told his audience that the fossil record of plants did not fit with Darwin's theory of evolution. And he explained that in the mid-Cretaceous, angiosperm fossils are found in considerable diversity. And here's some of the fossils that he would have been basing his comments on. These are identified as willows, beeches, oaks, and birches, and they appear in the mid-Cretaceous. But curiously, he said, before them, there are no angiosperm fossils. So angiosperm fossils suddenly appear in the Cretaceous, in the mid-Cretaceous, with no antecedents. And in his lecture, he described a fossil record which basically looked like this. He had monocots going right back to the Paleozoic, had gymnosperms going back to the Paleozoic, but what they then called angiospermous dicots, these just suddenly appeared in great diversity in the Cretaceous. And Carruthers argued that there was some evidence for evolution, but all of this was just within these groups. And so rather than a tree of life, he had a kind of orchard of life, if you like. Well, a couple of years later, one of Darwin's disciples was giving a lecture, and he said this when he described the pattern that Carruthers had explained in his lecture. To my mind, there is no alternative between abandoning the doctrine of evolution and admitting that the origin of the existing types of flowering plants is enormously more remote than the period as to which we have direct evidence. The difficulty to be got over is the utter absence of such evidence. So he's saying, it must have taken much, much longer than this for angiosperms to evolve. The problem is we can't find the fossils. Darwin read a copy of this lecture, and he wrote to the director of Kew Gardens, Joseph Hooker, who was a great friend of his, in 1879. And in his letter, he said this: "I have just read Ball's essay. It is pretty bold. The rapid development, as far as we can judge, of all the higher plants within recent geological times is an abominable mystery." And this letter has become very famous, and the term abominable mystery is one that you hear bandied around quite a lot by botanists. And Darwin continued, "I have fancied that perhaps there was during long ages a small isolated continent in the southern hemisphere which served as the birthplace of the higher plants, but this is a wretchedly poor conjecture." So Darwin was saying maybe they evolved in the southern hemisphere where we haven't actually yet researched the fossil record very much. So maybe one day we will find these fossils which are needed for gradual evolution of this group. Well, what happened since? Well, there's obviously been huge amounts of effort to explore the fossil record, and by 1903 the situation was like this. This is the year when Darwin's letter was first published. And what had happened was during the subsequent decades, people realised that they were mistaken in identifying monocot fossils in the Paleozoic. And so the monocots now appeared first in the Cretaceous as well. And this is when the public first heard Darwin's term, the abominable mystery. And so it became applied to all angiosperms as soon as it became public, monocots and dicots. And then today the situation is basically the same. We've slightly rearranged how we classify plants, and I'll come on to that a little bit later. But we basically have the same situation today. There have been times over the past century when people have thought they have discovered pre-Cretaceous angiosperms, but they've consistently been found to be mistaken. And in a very recent review on this subject by some paleobotanists and molecular biologists, in their section Moving Forward, they say, "We think it would be wisest to admit at this point that there is something fundamental that we do not understand about the origin of angiosperms." If you want to read more about that history of the fossil record, here's a couple of papers I've written recently on that topic. So that's the fossil record. How about the groups subordinate to groups? How well are they supporting Darwin's tree of life in the case of plants? Well, Darwin wrote in The Origin of Species, "The inevitable result of variation and natural selection is that the modified descendants proceeding from one progenitor become broken into groups subordinate to groups. Thus, the grand fact in natural history of the subordination of group unto group is, in my judgment, fully explained." And here's the famous diagram that he had of this ramifying tree in The Origin of Species. And when he talked about groups subordinate to groups, he was of course thinking about classifications like this, where you have monocots, dicots, angiosperms and gymnosperms within them. And in the conclusion of The Origin of Species, he was optimistic that the remaining problems that there were, because he knew that there were still problems in classifying groups subordinate to groups in natural history, he wrote this: "When the views entertained in this volume on the origin of species are generally admitted, when people agree, we can dimly foresee that there will be a considerable revolution in natural history. Our classifications will come to be, as far as they can be, so made genealogies, and will then truly give what may be called the plan of creation. The rules for classifying will no doubt become simpler when we have a definite object in view." So very optimistic there that his theory is going to really help people who are classifying plants and animals. Well, fast forward to the late 1930s, and there's a big debate happening in Britain about this very issue. And there are scientists range on both sides, some of them saying, well, evolution is helping us in taxonomy, and others saying, no, it's not. And interestingly, most of the delegates from Kew Gardens were on the side of, no, it's not. In 1981, Ernst Mayr, the very great evolutionary biologist, wrote a review in Science saying, currently a controversy is raging as to which of three competing methodologies of biological classification is the best, phonetics, cladistics, or evolutionary classification. And phonetics, that first one, is an approach that does not take the tree of life into account. And so, more than 100 years after the origin of species, there's still active debates going on among people classifying organisms about the usefulness of the Darwinian tree of life in classification. So his concluding remarks on the origin of species seem to have been a little over-optimistic. Well, what happened after that was molecular systematics came in, comparing sequence data from proteins and from DNA. And here's an early book on this topic by Pam and Doug Soltis and Jeff Doyle. This was published in 1992. Now, let me just very quickly explain how molecular systematics works. Some of you may have played a game that for some reason, I don't know why, we call it Chinese Whispers. I think in America they call it the telephone game. And this is often done in a party context, and you have everyone in a line, and somebody whispers to the first person a phrase, and they have to whisper it to the next person. It has to go on and on to the next person and the next person. And then by the time it goes right round the circle, you discover that a very different sentence has been passed on, because as it's gone round, there have been mistakes. It's mutated. And so now it's a different sentence. Now, imagine that you play that game, but instead of having people in a circle, you have them in a tree-like structure. Something might happen like this. So let's say we put in the phrase, Jack and Jill went up the hill. Well, if we've got these three different branches, we'll have three different outcomes. Now imagine one of them is Jack and Jill went up the mill, then the other is Jack and Jill set up the mill, and the other is Jacinda went up the hill. And from the different mistakes, we can infer the structure, the topology of the tree. You can see that there's a shared mistake, mill, in the first two. And that, of course, is because they are more closely related. They branched off more recently than the other one. The mistake Jacinda obviously happened on the bottom branch and not on the previous lineage. And then the set, the S, that happened on just the middle branch. And so from that series of mutations, you can infer the tree that underlies the outcome. And if you put a different sentence through this same group of people, and then a different sentence and a different sentence again, you would, on average, get the same outcome. You would always expect the first two to be more similar to each other than the last one, because they have a much shorter chain of people between them. So whatever sentence you put through, you should be able to reconstruct the same tree. And so that was the prediction. That is the prediction when we look at DNA or protein sequence data. And so in 1988, a major new classification of plants was proposed by the Angiosperm phylogeny group. And many of my colleagues at Kew were involved in this, as well as Doug and Pam Soltis, who I did my postdoctoral work with. And this was a slightly different classification to what had happened before. Among other things, what were previously known as the dicots got split up into two, and the monocots got put nested in the middle of them. Now, this was based just on 3 chloroplast genes. And the reason why no one batted an eyelid at it just being based on 3 chloroplast genes was because there was an overwhelming assumption that over long periods of time, every gene would essentially give the same tree. So it didn't really matter that there were just 3 chloroplast genes here. It would still be giving an accurate picture of the Darwinian tree of life, and so it would be a good classification. And so this was widely accepted. Herbaria and gardens got rearranged to reflect this rather than previous systems. And I won't go into the details here because they back up what I just said about people assuming that chloroplasts would be very adequate for the job. The assumption being that every gene would give the same tree. And indeed, in 1982, a group of scientists formalised this into a rigorous test of the reality of the Darwinian Tree of Life. So this was published in Nature, titled Testing the Theory of Evolution by Comparing Phylogenetic Trees Constructed from 5 Different Protein Sequences. And they say, here we present a programme applying graph theory by which it is theoretically possible to refute the existence of an evolutionary tree. And this is a very interesting paper because people very seldom are trying to prove the existence of the tree. So we assume that the tree exists, and then we use the DNA data to tell us what the pattern is, what the topology is of the tree. But people are very, very seldom asking the question, does the tree actually exist? This is one of the few papers I know of that does it, which is why I'm focusing on it so much. If you know of others, please let me know, because it's a very interesting topic. And they start the paper by making this point, that essentially just because you can build a tree from sequence data does not prove that that tree exists. So what they did was they took 5 different nucleotide sequences from 5 different genes, and they constructed trees for all of them, and then they compared the trees, and they said, well, if all of them give essentially the same tree, then the tree of life is confirmed. If they give different trees, then it's not confirmed. So really nice test. So essentially what they're saying is, if we end up with a pattern that looks like this, we know it's not an evolutionary tree. It must be a system that has come about in some other way. We've got 2 very different trees here, and when we superimpose them on one another, they look a bit of a mess. It's what you expect from a design system, but not from an evolved system. And they did this, and they found that their trees were pretty similar, and so they concluded, yes, the tree of life does exist. Now, Richard Dawkins picked up this and really ran with it and developed the idea in his book, The Greatest Show on Earth, Evidence for Evolution, that was published in 2009. And when he describes it, he writes this: the important result is that every gene delivers approximately the same tree of life. This is exactly what you would expect if you were dealing with a true family tree. It is not what you expect if a designer had surveyed the whole of the animal kingdom and picked and chosen or borrowed the best proteins for the job wherever in the animal kingdom they might be found. The intervening years, because he's writing many years after this paper, have seen a prolific multiplication of detailed evidence on the exact sequences of genes of lots and lots of species of animals and plants. It is the consistency of agreement among all the different genes in the genome that gives us confidence, not only in the historical accuracy of the consensus tree itself, but also in the fact that evolution has occurred in a Darwinian tree-like fashion. And after he wrote this book, he was going around doing interviews, and here's him being asked in the States, out of all the evidence used to support the theory of evolution, and bear in mind this is someone who's just written a book about evidence for evolution, what would you say is the strongest, most irrefutable single piece of evidence in support of the theory? And he picks on this. And he describes it and says, then you do the same thing for another gene and another, you get the same family tree. This is overwhelmingly strong evidence. The only way you could get out of saying that this proves that evolution is true is by saying that the intelligent designer, God, deliberately set out to lie to us, deliberately set out to deceive us. So, very strong on this. Well, is he actually correct? And many of you who, like me, work with sequence data every day have probably winced a little bit when you heard me read that out, because you know it is actually not the case. So here's, for example, a study that my group did on different species of ash. And here are trees, gene trees, from 4 different genes that I just picked haphazardly. I didn't hand-pick trees that look very different. And here I've highlighted by coloured lines a few of the same species. Each species has a number. Now, do these trees look the same to you? They're not at all the same, are they? You can see that, for example, in the first tree, Frax 13 is sister to Frax 33, and they together are sister to the outgroup, whereas in the second tree, Frax 13 is nested highly within the phylogeny and is very closely related to a whole bunch of other ones. These are not giving the same tree at all. And we were able to use this fact to identify genes that are involved in resistance to the emerald ash borer. And as we did that, we compared those individual gene trees to a tree that we had made that gave the best supported tree using all of these genes. And you can see this here on the figure. But as we did so, we knew that this tree that you're looking at here, which is what we call the consensus tree, although when I say consensus, that doesn't mean that it's not a consensus like in a political sense, it's a consensus in the best tree that we could get out of all the very, very divergent gene trees. But we were very aware as we used this, it was a useful tool, it's a useful way of thinking about the data, but do we actually think the history of these species followed a bifurcating Darwinian tree of life? Well, no, we don't. There's other things going on that cause the patterns of gene trees. These species are hybridizing with one another, and they've come from a population that had lots of sequence diversity, which has been partitioned in different ways into different species. And so this tree is a useful tool, but we don't think it's actually telling us the truth. But these are all obviously very closely related. All of these are in the same genus. We know that they can still hybridize. We know they can still cross with each other. They haven't had long to diverge. So the prediction would be, well, when you go to much deeper nodes in the tree of life, then you would see this pattern. Then you'll see every gene tree being the same. Well, here's a recent study that looked at some very deep nodes in the plant tree of life. It compared some of these early diverging eudicots. And you can see, I've highlighted each of those blue lines represents 50 million years. And so you can see we're looking at some really, really deep nodes in the plant tree of life. Well, surely when we're this deep in the tree of life, every gene tree should be the same, as Dawkins predicted. Well, Andrei Shandabali, the first author of this publication, kindly shared with me his data, and I just picked out the first few gene trees in his data. And again, you can see very, very different gene trees. These are not all giving the same tree at all. And when you plot 763 of these gene trees all together in a single diagram, you get something like this. You get this massive mess, you get this cloud of different points. And this is showing us we are very far from a situation where every gene is giving us the same tree. So according to Richard Dawkins' test of the Darwinian tree of life, we don't have much support for it, do we? It looks more like the hypothesis that he set up for an intelligent designer. Well, when this pattern was first discovered for bacteria, it was widely publicised, and even the New Scientist, about 10 years after it became known to scientists, the New Scientist had a big cover article, "Darwin was wrong, cutting down the tree of life." And you can also read about this in the 2018 book, The Tangled Tree, A Radical History of Life. And the author of that book raises the question towards the end of his section on the entanglement of these gene trees. Is it true that Charles Darwin was wrong? If so, about what? Has his theory of evolution been grievously challenged or just amended? And I think we're still really thinking through what the situation is here. How do we explain this? And does it fundamentally negate not only his tree of life, but also his mechanism of evolution by natural selection? So, that is the Darwinian tree of life. Does it exist? Well, I'll let you think that through for yourselves, and I'll come back to that in a bit. Now let's think about the biblical tree of life. Does this one exist? Well, obviously this is a very different proposition. This is a very different category of knowledge that we're talking about here. The tree of life is mentioned in the last book of the Bible called Revelation. And it's explicitly a vision. the book starts off, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants the things that must soon take place. And he made it known by sending his angel to his servant John, who bore witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ, even to all that he saw in this vision. So this isn't about scientific knowledge. This is about something that is being revealed to John. And of course, this means we only have John's word for it. So how do we work out? How do we figure out if it's true or not? Well, let's just think a little bit about what he says about this tree of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And this is Jesus speaking. To the one who conquers, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. That's near the beginning of the book. And then towards the end, then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. Also on either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Blessed are those who wash their robes so that they may have the right to the tree of life, and that they may enter the city by the gates. The Spirit and the bride say, Come, and let the one who hears say, Come, and let the one who is thirsty come, let the one who desires take of the water of life without price. Now, before we consider how we can know whether or not it's true, let's just think about what an appealing prospect this is. You know, just yesterday I learned that the mother of some of my childhood friends had died. I hadn't known she was ill, but just suddenly heard she had died. A week ago, I heard that someone who was an intern at Q died aged 23 in the middle of a PhD at Cambridge. On Sunday at church, I was talking to a man called Lionel, and I asked him how his trip had been to Barbados. He's part of the Windrush generation, and he visited some relatives in Barbados, and I asked him how he was, and he said, I've just been diagnosed with cancer. Could you pray for me? And then, of course, I go away and I think, oh, well, I'm having to get up in the night a bit more than I used to. You know, maybe I've got maybe I might have cancer too. Perhaps I'd better get checked out. And all around us is death. And so this tree of life, which represents eternal life and eternal healing and health, is, of course, a very appealing prospect. Now, that doesn't mean it's true, but I think it does mean that it's worth thinking about, because if it is true, obviously it is quite transformative. So here's a stained glass window showing this tree of life by the river. This is the artist's impression, and of course it's a symbol. It's this symbol's telling us the prospect of a future existence involving eternal life and eternal health. So how on the earth do we wrestle with whether or not this could possibly be true? Well, fortunately, John doesn't claim just to have written the book of Revelation. He also claims to have written a gospel, which is a biography of Jesus, as you all know, and also 3 very short letters. And the theme of life runs through all of them. And as I read them, it seems clear to me that they're the same author, because the same themes come up. He sort of writes in a similar way. Read them for yourself if you want to test out that. I don't have much time to go into it. But what's really noticeable about his letters and his gospel is the almost scientific emphasis he places on the quality of his witness. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim. And so when he's talking about things that have happened in the past, he's very keen to tell us, I know this empirically. I saw this, I touched this. But he claims to have seen some things that he calls signs, which are highly unexpected. He's accompanied a man called Jesus around for 3 years, and he claims to have seen water turned into wine. He claims to have seen a remote healing of a son, and various amazing happenings, all happening in a highly public context, and then culminating in a man called Lazarus being raised from the dead in front of a large crowd, and Jesus himself being killed by crucifixion and rising after 3 days. Now, obviously, this is very, very hard to believe, even though John is so keen to tell us these are things he saw and touched and heard. And at the end of his gospel, he even sort of makes a point of saying that he's talked about these signs because he wants to persuade us that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. See that theme of life coming up. Now, if John is an honest witness, then it makes sense that he would think, well, if only I can get them to believe what I saw with my own eyes, then surely they'll believe that Jesus is the Son of God, because, I mean, who else could do this kind of thing? So it all makes sense of his being truthful. But think what an incredibly high-risk strategy this is if he is just making this up. If he wants people to sort of follow the teaching of Jesus, surely mixing in all of these signs, rather than persuading people, is going to put them off, especially if he's writing very close to the time of the events, because people can go and ask, well, did you see that? This thing was meant to happen in Jerusalem. Here's someone who was in Jerusalem at that time. Did you hear about that? You know, it's very easy to verify these things. So it's a high-risk strategy. So Richard Dawkins has a solution to this problem, and that is that the Gospels themselves evolved. The Gospels are not reliable accounts of what happened in the history of the real world. All were written long after the death of Jesus. All were then copied and recopied through many different Chinese whispers generations by fallible scribes who in any case had their own religious agendas. So the view, which is quite a common view, is that the Gospels started off with some amazing teaching, some great moral teaching which we all admire, like the Golden Rule. But then over the ensuing centuries, people added in all this supernatural stuff. And that's why we have what we have today. And that sounds like a credible hypothesis. And so we can ask the question, well, did John's writings evolve over a long period of time? So a lot of the Bibles that we have today, certainly the Bibles that were available since the Reformation, something like, the Bibles that were common before the current century, they're all based on a Greek New Testament compiled by Erasmus in 1516. And so we might well say, well, okay, it's in Greek, which is the original language that the authors wrote in, but there's centuries and centuries and centuries over which evolution could have happened, and scribes could have conferred and made it look as if these 5 books were all by the same person. It could all have evolved. So we can have 2 hypotheses. One is that evolution happened. The other is that John actually wrote them and, he wrote about what he had seen. So we can test these 2 hypotheses by looking at manuscript evidence. Well, the texts that were available to Erasmus when he compiled were from after 1000 AD. So lots of potential for evolution. However, there's been lots of research on this, and this is not my own argument. I'm basing it on a book by Peter J. Williams, who's in Cambridge. And you may have, if you read Nature every week, you'll have come across him very recently. When his group were looking for ancient fragments of Bibles, they actually stumbled on an ancient star chart which had been lost, although it was well known. And there's quite a long article in a recent Nature about this ancient sky map. So if you have doubts about the credibility of this kind of research, it's worthy of Nature if it's on star charts, even if it's not when it's about the Bible. He points out that today we have a codex in the British Museum which has the whole of the Bible, the whole of the New Testament, and it's dated by scholars to 300 to 425 AD. And I'm just showing you the page with the beginning of John's revelation and the tree of life phrase. So immediately, if we plot that onto our phylogenetic trees, that very much favours the hypothesis that there hasn't been much evolution. But we can do even better than that. Here's a fragment of papyrus that was found in Egypt that's dated to 100 to 200 AD. And this is part of that very first chapter of John. It's not the actual bit that has about the tree of life, but it gets pretty close to it. So it looks as if at least that part of the text is unchanged since 100 to 200 AD. So we plot that onto our diagram. It's looking more in favour of John's authorship. And then if we plot on various other parchments that have been found, and you can find a list at the University of Munster, they keep a list of all of these fragments, we can see that John's Gospel has a lot of fragments from the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, and some for Revelation, not many for the epistles, but each of them is incredibly short, so we would hardly expect to find a lot of them. So looking at this kind of fossil record and how it has developed over the years since the Reformation, we can see that this is supporting more and more the idea that John actually wrote this. But then we have this conundrum. If he was writing that at a time when his claims were actually testable, how did he get away with it? How did Christianity take off? And we know for sure that Christianity did take off. So at the start of Revelation, John places himself very clearly in space and time on the island of Patmos. You can look this up on Google Maps. It's a small spiritual island with a monastery. And he wrote the letter, when he wrote Revelation, he wrote it partly as a letter to 7 different churches, all of which are in Asia Minor. We can locate all of them in space and time. So although it's a vision, the way he's written it does sort of thread in contemporary details. I want you to just look just above the location of where those churches are. There's a region called Bithynia and Pontus. And in 109 to 111 AD, Pliny the Younger was the governor of Bithynia and Pontus. And he came across Christians, and large numbers of Christians. He was writing to the emperor, asking his advice. He was having Christians executed. He'd investigated something of their beliefs. He discovers that they sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and they try to live good lives. So immediately we're getting some pretty clear indications of what Christian doctrines are. And he wanted advice because so many people are being affected by this. If he keeps killing people, well, persons of every age, every rank, and also both sexes are and will be endangered, for the contagion of this superstition has spread not only to the cities, but also to the villages and farms. So Christianity is obviously growing very fast in this region at this time. But how could it be if these signs that John had talked about had just been made up? Because people could have easily looked into this and found, well, no evidence at all. No one seems to have any recollection of this happening. Therefore, it can't be true. Very hard to see how people would be willing to be executed for something which they could test and find wanting. So just putting together my flow of logic here, John claims to have had a revelation about future life. These claims cannot, of course, be directly tested. We only have his word for it. However, he claims to have witnessed signs from the Son of God in the past, so we can think about what he tells us about the past. These claims were testable if he was writing before 100 AD. If his claims were false, Christianity would surely not have grown. There's a fossil record of manuscripts that makes an early date for John's writing reasonable and subsequent evolution unlikely. Christianity was growing rapidly in Bithynia and Pontus in AD 110, and we know from other evidence it was growing elsewhere. Therefore, we should not lightly dismiss John's claims. But there's more to it than that. Now, I'm not renowned, those of you who know me, I'm not renowned for my knowledge of popular culture. Here's another John who is known as Johnny Cash, who many of you probably know more about than I do. I have to admit, I came across this song because they were singing it in a church I went to once in the USA. And he writes about the tree of life. And Johnny Cash really sort of puts his finger on the real essence of why Christians believe in it. Most Christians aren't thinking about the fossil record of manuscripts. They're thinking about their own life and their own experience. And Johnny Cash recognises that the tree of life in the Bible is very closely linked to the tree of death, which is the cross of Christ. And he's describing Jesus on the cross. From the hands it came down, from the side it came down, from the feet it came down and ran to the ground. Between heaven and hell a teardrop fell. In the deep crimson dew the tree of life grew. And the blood gave life to the branches of the tree. And the blood was the price that set captives free. And the numbers that came through the fire and the flood clung to the tree and were redeemed by the blood. And if you put it in this context of redemption and the context of the cross, which of course is at the centre of the Christian faith, it's how Christians get right with God through Jesus taking away their sins, then the tree of life comes from this because our sins, which give us death, are dealt with, and then we can therefore have life. And this, of course, is available to everyone. We heard at the end of Revelation, it's come, come, come. So it's something available to everyone. And it's the juxtaposition of these two things. It's this logical sequence of how redemption works that Johnny Cash picks up on, and indeed every Christian picks up on. And at the end of the day, this is at the heart of why Christians believe in the tree of life, because it's such a logical outworking of what happens on the cross. So the tree of death leads to the tree of life. So let's come back to our original question. Well, do they exist? Well, obviously, I can't prove to you that either of these trees of life exist. Now, that's probably a surprise to you because you probably thought, well, he can prove that the Darwinian tree of life exists, but he can't prove that the biblical tree of life exists. And I have to say, well, I can't actually prove to you that either of them exists. However, I would say that given both concepts, and of course in their way both of them are somewhat symbolical, we could reasonably expect there to be overwhelming evidence in the physical world for the Darwinian tree of life. But in some ways there is not. On the other hand, evidence that we could reasonably expect there to be for the biblical tree of life does seem to be present. So where does that leave us? Well, you will all have responded to this lecture in different ways. But one thing I can guarantee is that your personal conclusions will have depended a great deal on your prior beliefs as you walked into the room. Some of you will have heard me say what I've said about the Darwinian tree of life, and you'll have thought, well, okay, there's something weird going on for plants, but, well, it will be solved within the next 100 years of science. Others of you will have heard it and thought, well, I don't believe in that at all. The same with the biblical tree of life. Some of you will think, wow, yeah, it's good evidence for that. Others of you will think, oh, well, it's all wishful thinking and it's just too good to be true anyway. And that is because when we walked into the room, we had prior beliefs. We come into the room with a worldview. And in particular, the issue of whether or not we think there is a God and whether or not we think he would actually intervene in the world around us. So I know that tonight, I'm very unlikely to actually change anyone's mind on this issue, but I might perhaps have slightly shifted your priors in one direction or another. And of course, this is something that we can have further conversations about. I hope this will be inaugural of a conversation rather than valedictory to a conversation. But what can we agree on right now? Well, I think there are things we can agree on. As I've tried to put together what we might call a scientific belief with what we might call a religious belief, though I would of course contest those categories somewhat. One thing I think we all agree on is the need for inclusion in the sciences. And this is something that we're particularly aware of at the moment. We should have been aware of it, of course, long ago, but it's something which is now being written about a lot. And ecology and evolutionary biology is a particularly white discipline. And there's quite a literature now about how this can be changed. Of course, much of it is from an American perspective. But even in Britain, we do have issues regarding diversity. But I think that one of the issues that doesn't get talked about enough, and it isn't really talked about in these papers that I'm putting up on the screen here, is the issue of how religion interacts with race and ethnicity. Here's a map of the world showing certain countries where surveys have been done among Christians, asking them how important religion is to their lives. This is just asking Christians, just saying how important is religion to their lives. In the UK, 11% of Christians, people who identify as Christians, say it's important to their lives. Now look at sub-Saharan Africa. All of them, except South Africa, above 80%. Ethiopia is there at 98%. And of course, there are very, very many Christians in sub-Saharan Africa. And so we need to be thinking about religion and inclusion of religion, as well as merely thinking in terms of ethnicity, because the two are so intertwined. And here at Queen Mary, of course, we are the most diverse university in the Russell Group, and we know in our daily lived experience that there is a very strong correlation between people's ethnicity and their religions. Now, there's a researcher called Elizabeth Barnes in the States who is doing research on this very issue. And she has found that you could call Christianity a concealable stigmatized identity among biology graduate students. In a study, she found that biology graduate students who are Christian tend to hide their beliefs because they find that the atmosphere they're in is one that tends to essentially assume atheism or deep skepticism towards religion. And in my own personal experience, I've often encountered this, and I've heard stories from different parts of the world where undergraduates have actually been put off of studying biology at a higher level, doing a master's or doing a PhD, because of things that have been said to them in lectures by their undergraduate lecturers. And little throwaway comments that are very critical of religious views, and that the lecturer makes, probably not really appreciating what an impact it's going to have on some of the undergraduates that they're speaking to, and have actually completely put them off of doing biology. And I think this is a great pity, and I definitely know individuals who this has impacted their career choices. But I also think that more openness to different ideas and different worldviews is also good for science itself. I think one of the reasons why the period of Charles Darwin was so productive in biology was because back then people with very different worldviews were active within science and could point out things that were very inconvenient to Darwin. Today that happens very little. And I think if we did have more diversity of opinion, it would actually be good for science, for the process of scientific discovery itself. So, Professor Wen Wang, I hope I've done what you asked me to in talking about Christianity and science in this lecture, and I do hope this will start a conversation, particularly as here at Queen Mary we pride ourselves on being the most diverse university within the Russell Group. Thank you very much.